My name is Clint Tennant. My friend Terry was never a world beater, I guess you'd say. Who of us is? When he was 28, he went back home to take care of his mom until she died, and then he kept living in their modular house out in the middle of nowhere, not really seeing anyone from the old college gang anymore. He'd stopped working, but he managed to bring in a little money for a while through a thing he could at least call his own, and I know that made him feel good. He did a bit of YouTubing, showing off his very rare and very odd talent. He posted 8 or 9 videos, and it became a viral blip for 6 weeks or so. His 15 minutes of fame had more or less run out by the time I decided to finally pay him a real visit one Friday after 3 years of natural separation. Just life getting in the way, you know. He was living off the rest of his mother's life insurance and not doing much but watching the days go by when I drove from my condo in Gillick Lake further out toward the country, for old time's sake. I kind of liked it out there where he lived, on the very edge of the Lyra forest. The house was a prefabricated thing, single story, delivered whole on the back of a tractor trailer back in the day to a smooth, empty field beside the woods. At dusk, we took a couple of canvas chairs and went to get drunk near a healthy-sized pond a stone's throw away, grateful for a warm front that kept the winter chill nicely in check. Terry always had a good sense of humor about his life, and that evening we reminisced about our bone-headed frat days as we ate take-out Indian food and downed it all with a 12-pack of Modelo. I felt far away from my lousy insurance job. Then I had to open my mouth and ruin everything by saying to Terry, "Hey, do the thing." Normally that would be a harmless, if irritating request, but something had changed. Terry's face became noticeably distressed in that almost purple light just before sunset. He said he couldn't do the thing anymore. And then he told me about the accident. See, when Terry was 19 or so, he realized there was an interesting side effect of his naturally reedy and rocky voice, the voice that had troubled him since junior high and made him feel like an outcast, stole his confidence. He used to go hunting with his dad, and he turned out to be a natural duck caller. That's really rare. Terry didn't need any kind of artificial apparatus to flawlessly simulate the sounds of mallards and canvasbacks. Then he progressed to something more challenging and satisfying, owl calls. One time on summer break when I was at his house, we walked out near the pond and he gave me a demonstration, and it was pretty freaky to see the response. It was like a spontaneous owl convention suddenly broke out beside the water, with 3 of the suckers flying in almost right away to see what the fuss was. They came right up close, and it was strange to be looked at by those weirdly observant, spooky little faces. The Packers of some people, that stood for primary auditory cortical regions, he once explained to me after he'd read up on it some, are just wired different, which was why he could imitate some bird calls so well. But it turned out it was a little more than that, which Terry found out when he got a bad case of tonsillitis a couple of years after we'd gotten our diplomas. A doctor informed him that the surgery to cure him would be a fair bit more complicated than normal because he'd been born with a curious, tiny extra flap in his vocal cords, which was likely responsible all his life for the way he projected his sounds differently. The surgery worked, but apparently it changed the way nodules formed on his vocal cords, something like that. Terry swore the subtle change in the sounds of his owl calls made the results even more potent. Then, after some vocal experimentation on Terry's part, not just owls, but other animals seemed to come when he put his hands to his mouth and let loose in a certain prolonged way. Though to me and every other human, it just sounded like a strange, shaky, winding whoop and chuff, punctuated by a kind of low growl. Here would come crows and rabbits and deer, and even once, in an especially memorable 3-minute YouTube video, a wild turkey. It was freaky, just a tiny bit scary, and always fascinating, even when, for reasons Terry never understood, sometimes there was no animal response to his calls at all. Nature was a baffler, he knew. All kinds of strange vibrations and patterns and BS like that no one can see, he'd once said to me, amused. If the wind's right, it's an animal parade. If there's the wrong type of cloud or something, nada. Makes no sense. Doing the calls on video had first occurred to Terry when he couldn't work at his gym sales job anymore because he had to take care of his mom full time. He told me part of it was a way to nod to his late father. They were out near the pond that was technically on state land. He told me that just 6 months before, he'd been driving his mom's station wagon to pick up some seeds from the hardware store, and some idiot had run a stop sign and T-boned him. His throat had slammed against the steering wheel, and he had to have emergency surgery so he could breathe. He'd been in the hospital for a month. I had no idea this had happened. His vocal cords had been directly damaged this time, which I guess explained why his voice did sound different. Near the end of his physical therapy, he'd been out in the woods nearby alone, and he'd tried to do the animal call, figuring it would be a good test of his recovery. He even recorded it just in case he might feel like posting another video again. That troubled look returned to his face as he finished another beer. It came out all wrong, he said contemplatively. Sounded awful and hurt my throat pretty bad, so I knew I was done. Guess I'll have to learn medical coding or something. It was almost full dark, and our ears and noses were starting to really feel the cold. The warm front was supposed to come to a bleak end, met rudely by clouds bringing light snow the very next morning. We tucked the chairs under our arms and headed back to the house. There, we watched Altered States on DVD like we used to. Still buzzed at 10 o'clock, I played it safe and crashed on the old sofa in the living room. I was very much looking forward to buying my old buddy a big, gruesome pancake breakfast down the road in the morning, and fell asleep thinking of bacon. My eyes opened prematurely well before dawn. I was sensing a presence nearby. That's another inexplicable nature trick, right? The body knowing somehow that another body is near, even in sleep. I woke fully to see Terry sitting at the kitchen table in the dark, sipping some instant coffee, looking like he'd just gotten up. He wasn't waiting for me to do the same. He was just sleepless, thinking about something. He apologized for accidentally waking me up. I dragged myself off the sofa and thought maybe I could convince him to head off to the diner early so I could get back home and have a full Saturday ahead of me. My wife wanted to go ice skating. But Terry's mood was strange, and something was clearly wrong, so I dropped that idea quickly. He rubbed his face, patted down some of his hair, which was sticking up all around. The feeble light that lit up the stove area behind him made him look ill. He said he hadn't told me everything about that last animal call he'd tried, the one that went kind of wrong. He wasn't sure why he'd found the need to censor himself. If he didn't tell me, he said, who was he ever going to tell? That was when I began to suspect he was probably more lonely than I'd even thought. I guess we all know someone who withdraws a little from the world and never really comes back to it. The inertia of solitude building month by month until the cocoon becomes permanent. He got up and went to fetch his cell phone from his bedroom because it had something on it he really wanted me to see. I microwaved some black coffee of my own as I waited for him to come back. I'd just finished stirring my sugar in when he took his chair again, having delved into his media archive and located exactly what he wanted me to watch. He pressed play on an app and handed the phone to me. It was the video he'd made of that animal call the previous October, which he'd never uploaded anywhere. I sipped and watched as he crossed his arms and leaned back in his chair, very tired, hungover. He'd shot the video in his usual unforced style, just pointing the phone's camera into the distance, no tripod. I asked him where this was made, and he briefly lifted a finger toward the west side of the house. "Just the woods here," he mumbled. On the screen, the trees crowded near and far under a very gray sky, and there was a faint rain visible if you looked close. The leaves hadn't quite changed fully for the season, and they were still plentiful on the trees. It was very quiet, and then you heard Terry unleash the latest version of his altered animal cry. The first couple of seconds, at least, sounded a little like his old stuff. But then the pitch went way off, and the peculiar warbling, which used to sound almost melodic, was grating and strange instead, more like a rapid series of amplified vibrations, disjointed tones repeating many times per second inside his throat. Then came that guttural growling sound, almost twice as loud as what had come just before it, so low and intense you might mistake it for a lion. That was very different from how it used to be, much more threatening. And then at the very end, a kind of finale that was also new. Terry's throat, not his lips, but his throat itself, began to whistle, a sickly sound that kept rising and winding and twisting somehow, until it all ended in a hollow echo. "Jesus," I said, "is that because of the operation?" "Keep watching," Terry said. Right after that bizarre call, Terry had lowered the phone camera clumsily, as if the force of his effort, or maybe the unexpected sound of it, had almost caused him to stop recording entirely. But he'd lifted the camera again, and the focus adjusted and held on the densely packed trees, leaves and branches dripping. His breath could be heard on the audio track, and he sounded winded. When the recording resumed, a new sound squeaked through the phone speaker. The movement of something big in the woods, slowly displacing whatever could make a sound on the forest floor. Twigs, branches, leaves. Nothing was visible, though, and Terry kept the camera angle consistent until it became obvious that the disturbance was slowly getting closer. At one point he tried to zoom in on a particular patch of trees, but this didn't produce the desired result of fixing on something tangible. Finally, though, there it was. A moving patch of dark gray in the distance. Wood continued to snap. It took my mind a moment to absorb the scale of what I was seeing, and realize that the thing moving out there was at least 7 or 8 feet high. It kept going, left to right. Audibly losing his composure, Terry had begun to zoom in and out, amateurishly and ineffectively as he'd begun to back away. But nothing he could do with the camera would bring the creature into any more detail. At that distance it was only a noiseless shape, a non-vocal bulk, and its movement was suggested mostly by the sounds of what had broke beneath it. Even before the video ended, I slid my finger to the left to rewind some so I could refocus my gaze on certain parts of the screen where I thought I'd gotten a better sense of what the thing was. But all I could say for sure was that it was just a little darker than the trees around it, and its somewhat disjointed movement suggested that, like us, it walked on tall legs. In the end, Terry hadn't been able to control his fear and investigate, and the image skewed wildly as he lowered the camera and stopped recording. He hadn't stuck around to see what might happen next. I felt like I had a million questions, but I let Terry talk first. He took the phone back into his hand and set it on the table, screen down, as if he were disgusted by it. He had no idea what he'd seen in the woods that day, he told me, and it had just been that one time. He'd never gone back into them since then. The night before, when we'd been drinking and chilling out near the pond, that was the first time he'd gotten that close since he'd made the recording. "It's not all about the thing, whatever that was," he said to me, so haggard. "It was my voice. I mean, that sound wasn't normal at all. It just wasn't. I'm afraid to try again." I had to agree. I didn't want to lie to him. I thought about picking the phone off the table and queuing the video up a second time, maybe turning the volume all the way down. I didn't want to hear the distinct, creepy chapters of his animal call, and definitely not the sum of those parts, which struck me as not just mysterious, but unnatural, something it shouldn't have quite been possible for a human voice to generate. I tried to go down a very short list of what that thing in the woods might have been, but Terry had been thinking about this for months already and knew it was a logical dead end. It was still an hour before sunup, but neither one of us felt much like going back to sleep. I should have gently overruled him when he suggested we get breakfast going there at the house instead of heading out. It wasn't like him at all to turn down a free diner trip, but he did. That should have worried me. Maybe I was just too wiped out to make enough of it, or maybe the video and its awful sounds had temporarily blocked out real rational thought. Whatever the case, we stayed. A half-pound of bacon went into the microwave, and Terry had made dried cherry and sea salt granola. We tried to talk about other things, the denizens of the area's woods in general, their migration patterns, their little quirks and eccentricities. A brown bear cub had once showed up in response to one of his old YouTube calls, looking at him intently from across a field of ryegrass. "Nothing normal came that last time," he said, staring out the kitchen window as we ate unenthusiastically. "Nothing but that thing." The flurries had started outside, very peaceful. I tried to shift topics again to what sci-fi movies he'd been watching recently, but Terry engaged with that discussion very half-heartedly. While he got a little more coffee nuked up for us, I headed for the bathroom. There I splashed cold water on my face and just leaned over the tap, trying to stop thinking. I would have liked to stay in there much longer, but finally I returned to the table. Terry had filled our cups, but then gone back into his bedroom. I waited for him, watching the gentle snow. It was a half hour till official sunrise, according to my phone. I reached out and turned Terry's phone over. I'd watch the video just one more time. One more. But Terry was coming back down the hall. Now he had his winter coat on, and he'd buried his t-shirt under a red hoodie. "I think," he said to me. My voice was born strange to begin with, and the accidents kept making it stranger. First it was the stupid ducks that listened, and then other things. And now, he trailed off there. I asked him where he was going, but I think I already knew. "You're here now, so it's safer," he said. "If I try just one more time, let's see what shows up." I was awake enough now for that to sound like a truly bad idea, not just because Terry's own mental health might not stand up so well to it, but because I was actually somewhat scared. I started to argue against it, but he interrupted. "Play back that call again," he said, pointing at his phone. "You know what I sound like, aside from a freaking alien? It's how the devil would sound standing outside your door saying, 'Come out, come out.'" There'd be time, I rationalized, to sort out a strategy for persuading Terry to talk to someone smarter than me about his troubled state of mind. For now, though, I doubled down on being his friend. I said, "Okay, sure, we can go out as soon as it's actually, morning." But he didn't want to wait another minute. We had just a little time left before daylight, and he had this irrational but very strong feeling that the dark would be better. So, we headed out. A listless blue gloom greeted us in the back field before the woods. The snow was steady but wispy and harmless. I let Terry lead the way so he'd go only where he felt safe. I was still clutching the paper cup with the last of my coffee in it, mostly to feel normal. What terrible thing could really happen to anyone carrying Sanka in a cup with little flower shapes on it? The weeds whisked our ankles as we walked toward the nearest gap in the trees. It was the beginning of a naturally worn footpath leading deeper. I almost asked Terry to stop right there, because the pre-dawn light wasn't strong enough to seep down onto the forest floor, and it was going to be difficult to see anything at all. But after we'd dodged and weaved on the skinny trail half-blind for just a couple of minutes, pushing low-hanging branches out of our way, we came to a clearing where things brightened a little. It was just a wide, shallow bowl of weeds and scrub before another more expansive and even thicker patch of woods. We stopped and stood at the foot of the clearing. It would have looked quite beautiful and peaceful to me had I been totally in my right frame of mind. "Are you going to listen?" Terry asked me. I nodded, steeling myself for the sound of the call, unfiltered and so near. He cupped his hands to his mouth and hesitated. The wind drifted across the weeds gently, too weak to make the slightest alteration to the daunting trees beyond them. The snow kept falling undisturbed. Finally, Terry performed. And yes, it was worse this time, a good deal worse. So much so I closed my eyes halfway through to at least partially screen my traumatized senses. I still won't claim that the sound that emerged from his throat was meant for another world. I do feel that if it were to be graphed and charted by whatever kind of expert does that kind of thing, its characteristics could be contained inside the digits and equations and symbols that are used by scientists to describe human sound. I'm more certain that it was simply never meant to be heard in our predictable living realm, that no human could be truly ready for that jarring medley. What I remember most is the powerful echo at the very end. That, yes, and also the final whistling note Terry produced, which spiraled out toward the trees, and which the echo repeated perfectly, not just once, but twice before there was silence again. Terry bent over at the waist, breath pouring out of his mouth in a visible cloud, and rested his hands on his knees. I put a hesitant hand on his shoulder and asked him if he was okay. He nodded and tried to stand straight sooner than he was ready for, seeming dizzy. We waited. The minutes passed. In his YouTube days, it never seemed more than 60 seconds before some kind of animal crashed to the scene in response to one of Terry's calls. But he was ready to stay for as long as it took. We didn't say anything to each other, just stood like statues among the scenery. I finally checked my phone, feeling we'd crossed the 10-minute mark, and it turned out to be more like 12. I felt a slow wave of relief wash through me. I began to anticipate the wonderful feeling of normality and reason that would come with us back down the footpath if we could go just another minute or so with nothing coming out of the trees in front of us. Normality, rationality, coffee, home. "Look," I heard Terry say just before I suggested we go. He was pointing low at a spot where the field ended and those woods began. What looked like a fox had popped its head up above the weeds, looking at us quizzically. It was too dark to see color convincingly, but its fur was certainly not the traditional rusty red we would have expected. A slightly different species, maybe. "It's black," Terry said wonderingly. As my eyes adapted, I could see this was true. I asked Terry if that was possible, and he said, yeah. I've since learned that this can mean the fox is melanistic, having too much pigmentation. Like we kept finding out, nature never stops defying expectations. Funky little SOB, I said, and forced a chuckle. The fox kept watching us, studying us, and I believe it never took its eyes off us all through what happened next. It began with a sound from the trees I'll describe this way. Imagine the motor of an old, suffering, high-speed electric fan struggling against the heat in a tenement building. Yeah, it was like that, but more organic and tinged with a low, throaty rumble. It was repetitive and unceasing, and getting closer. I involuntarily backed up a step and looked at Terry. He stared at the trees, intent on standing his ground against whatever might appear. Something new came into view then. Cloaked by the near dark, the bulk of the staggered trees, and even the late snow. It was a walking thing, and it clearly was the source of that bizarre staccato vocalization, something cicadas might make if they were grossly oversized. 7 or 8 feet tall, I'd first guessed it was from watching the video, but now I thought maybe it was even taller than that. It did not hesitate to move forward toward the clearing instead of giving the man who'd summoned it a wide berth with a parallel path. I'd just started to make out the outline of a turning head atop massive shoulders when there was a split-second burst of dull amber light from that section of its body. It could have been mistaken for a low-watt flashlight beam except for its muted color and its transience. I realized that the thing's head itself had caused that pulse of bioluminescence, like it was taking a visual flash photo of the space around it while still trying to stay concealed. It had almost reached the clearing. Here's what I'm sure of. The creature had 3 legs, not just 2. I saw no outward bulge of arms at all, or a mouth, but that doesn't mean they weren't there. And when the entire head pulsed amber once more, for an extra half-second this time, I saw inside the glow a pair of large holes which might have represented eye sockets, except they were aligned not horizontally but vertically. That choppy, machine-like echoing sound was so prominent now, I had to raise my voice to rip Terry's attention away from the woods, and I punched his shoulder at the same time to get him turning in the other direction. We were both smart enough to abandon all pretense of courage and scientific fascination and just run. I'd always been faster, and Terry wound up following someone far less familiar with the footpath than he was. I cried out in pain when I tried to move too fast past a low branch, and it slapped me squarely in the mouth, drawing blood. I even zigged left when I should have zigged right, and I heard Terry shout out a correction, and he overtook me at last. Despite our clumsiness, our legs did not fail us. I might have been convinced to cower inside the house and watch through the windows to see what might come out. But when we got back onto Terry's property beyond the footpath, he naturally headed for the passenger side door of my car, shooting me a look that meant he hoped I had my keys on me. I had them out of my pocket in 3 seconds. So in the end, we simply got on the road and left the scene behind for hours. Not until late afternoon, when the sun actually managed to break through the clouds just the slightest comforting bit, did we feel it was safe to head back. I remember that day we spent in hiding well. As ghastly as the circumstances were, and no matter how nervously we talked all day about what had happened, It managed to bring back memories of summer vacation days we used to burn in each other's company or with other friends. Terry and I debated what to do about our experience over more coffee in some chain place, and then over a pizza in a sleepy local joint with graffiti-scratched tables and a fortune-telling machine in one corner. Finally, having come up with no great answers, we tried to forget things and delay our return by nosing around a used bookstore. It was just like old times, years before the concept of loneliness lost its poetic associations for me, and I saw it instead for what it really was, a devourer of spirit and of potential, a slow and quiet killer of people like my friend. I vowed inwardly not to keep letting Terry drift away, forgetting how powerful that sad undertow had already proved itself. The end result of those hours was Terry making a vow himself. He would preserve his own sanity by never attempting another animal call, and to sell the house as soon as he was able. That's just what he wound up doing. In fact, he never spent one more night in that place. He called his older brother in Nashua, told him the story, and wound up staying with him for months, eventually getting a pretty good job there with a boating magazine and an apartment in town. I honestly thought Terry's life was getting better since then, though I knew he wasn't ever able to shake the feeling of holding something inside him that was unnatural and dangerous. He went into therapy to try to get to a place of peace where he could separate his awful, accidental talent from who he was as a human being. We were able to hang out again once in a great while here in Gillick Lake, but then the momentum of life and work and family and commitments naturally started to push us apart again. Terry just left me a message on my cell. "Been a while, Beanpole," he started jovially enough, but the message ended badly. He asked if I want to come with him when he finally goes back out into the Lyra forest again this weekend, Thanksgiving weekend. He said he's tried hard to avoid it, but his curiosity is too intense. Maybe because he's been at a loss for what to do with himself these days. Friends have apparently been difficult to make, dates even more so. And sometimes, he said, he wakes up from dreams where he's in full throat on a twisting trail, bellowing out for something to respond to him. I think what he wants most is to feel powerful again, just for a moment. And how could I blame him? Now I sit here with my phone in my hand, wondering whether I have much of a choice but to go out there again, into the winter woods with my old buddy. I don't want him heading out alone along some twisting trail before sunrise or at dusk. A rare black fox might be roaming those woods still. Maybe we'll be able to get it on video this time.